No one is surprised when a newly elected government decides to create new initiatives and new organisations to signify a change in direction and a break from the past. Skills England, a new agency within the Department for Education, was announced by Prime Minister Keir Starmer just after last year's general election, along with his observation that our skills system is in a mess. But since that announcement, Skills England has not had an easy ride, with some observers describing it as a power grab that lacks clarity and clout, while others have questioned whether we needed Skills England in the first place. So why has the government created Skills England? What challenges is Skills England likely to face inside and outside central government? And will Skills England, as the Prime Minister promised, transform our approach to meeting skills needs over the coming decades, or will it end up causing more problems than it solves? My guests are Kirsty Donnelly, MBE, Chief Executive at the City and Guilds Group, and Rob Nitch, Chief Executive at the Federation of Awarding Bodies. I'm Tom Richmond, and to find out whether Skills England has the skills that England needs, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Skills England has not formally begun operating just yet, as it's been in shadow form since the end of last year. So there is still plenty we don't know at this point. But the government has been quite bold in setting out their ambitions for Skills England, at least, even going back to their time in opposition. So, Kirsty, what have we heard from the government about why they think a new body like Skills England is actually needed?
Yeah, Tom, it's a really good reflection, isn't it? I think we've probably all been reflecting on, what exactly will Skills England ultimately do, coming off the back of the work that the already existing then Institute for Apprenticeships was already doing. And I think, look, every new government that comes into power always wants to put its footprint down. The good news is Skills, I think, is really having its moment, in the sun, so to speak, in the sense that, if we look across everything that the Prime Minister has talked to since his inaugural speech, at the first Labour conference when they were in power, came into power last September, right through to all the work across the 5 missions that have been talked about, Skills is very much a central plank. And so I think we can take a lot of heart from that and think, are we finally, is a message getting through that this country cannot grow, cannot survive, cannot get out of the problems that it's actually got unless we put skills front and centre. And therefore, that's good news message. And therefore, I think this government has gone, okay, if we accept that, and I think we do, as a government, as a country, what do we now need to do to control it? And I think that's one of the problems we have with any government is this need to kind of want to control everything. And therefore, I think Skills England is a kind of control measure that's been brought in to actually therefore control the skills agenda that the government now accept needs to go operate across all of its 5 missions, and indeed the work of all of the government departments. So in many respects, I'm very grateful that this Labour government has recognised that skills cannot just be a function of itself. It's got to be part of every single directorate, every single department that exists across the government. But to do that and to do that well, having a central organisation, a central body, a central mission, like Skills England, is therefore their control lever, is how I perceive it right now. Now, in many respects, Tom, there's nothing wrong having a control lever, of course. But one of the things we need to do with skills is almost unleash it in many respects and provide some freedom for skills to operate where they most need to operate, which is, right down at the grassroots level inside, towns and cities and villages all over the country that are missing the skills that we need today. And therefore, one of the central jobs that I believe Skills England has got to do and do really, really well. And the question will be, will it, can it, if it's got this kind of controlling department lens on it, is make sure that skills are delivered where they're most needed in the most timely way. And the freedom for operating skills at a local level with local employers, with local providers, I do question whether we're going to see that level of freedom come about. So at its heart, I think Skills England is a planning and controls tool to help this government understand where it can put what is very precious resource. And let's be honest, very little funding that we've got right now, because we're hearing about some new funding, but we're not really hearing about new funding yet. And until we can map what the funding is going to look like to the skills that are needed and get that down at a grassroots level, it's hard to know how successful Skills England really, really can be. Ultimately, Skills England also has to have teeth. It needs to have the teeth to be able to move the funding around. So if we find that there is more outputs being delivered in Region X over Region B, and there's a greater need from Region B, then there should be an opportunity for that funding to be directed where it's most needed. So a true output measure delivery system, you might say.
Okay, so there's nothing too surprising about a government setting up a new body. There's nothing too surprising about the government wanting to try and control some parts of their upcoming agenda, but perhaps some uncertainty about how this is going to play out in practice, which I'm sure we'll pick up on during our conversation today. But as you mentioned, Kirsty, one of the things that we do know is that Skills England will supposedly be taking on many of the responsibilities previously carried out by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, or IFATE for short, which is now being abolished. So, Rob, as someone who spent many years working at the IFATE, how similar or different do you think Skills England will be from its closest predecessor?
Thanks, Tom. And I think there are two sort of areas that it's different. One is in what it's going to do, and second in how it's wired up within government. So in terms of the what it's going to do, IFATE's role was to approve the endpoint assessment for apprenticeships. So that's the sort of output bit of apprenticeships, but also the content of apprenticeships. So it designed and delivered apprenticeships. And it also approved qualifications. So organisations that design qualifications would bring them and they would be approved by IFATE, which actually it's not a group of civil servants. The civil servants in IFATE corral employers to do the approval. So that was what IFATE did. Skills England is going to do four things. The first thing it's going to do is to deliver that approvals function that was delivered by IFATE. But there is an ambition that there'll be wider participation in that approvals journey, for example, from trade unions. So it'll be a bit broader than currently just that focus on employers, as I've described it. The second bit of the Skills England sort of mission is to define what the economy needs to be successful. And Kirsty was referring to this earlier on. So what is needed? Where do we wish to move forward? To try and work out where we best invest our money. The third function is actually to invest that money. So we're moving from a situation where there was an apprenticeship levy to a growth and skills levy is the ambition of this government. And that money will be allocated by Skills England, as I understand it. And the final function of Skills England, which I think is a really important one, is to work with the strategic authorities, the devolved assemblies, to try and get a more even approach across the UK. And, the situation currently is that you can do an apprenticeship in Wales, but it's not recognised in England. Education's devolved, that's fine. But actually, sort of the boundaries are significant. So 4 bits to the mission of Skills England: approvals, prediction of demand, putting the money against that demand, the growth and skills levy, and also working with devolved assemblies and strategic authorities to get a more universal approach across the UK. I did mention that there was also some structural differences. IFATE was a non-departmental public body, which meant that it had some legal autonomy. Skills England is being created as an executive agency, which means it's got no independent legal authority. There is more direct control in law for Skills England, which derives much more of its authority from the Secretary of State for Education rather than through an independent board.
Okay, so it sounds as though Skills England is going to be quite different, a slightly different proposition from its predecessor. So it's going to take on some of the responsibilities, but at the same time add in some more strategic work, seems to be the plan. But as you mentioned, that decision to make Skills England less independent than the IFATE has certainly proved quite controversial in parliamentary debates over the past few weeks and months. But regardless, Skills England is on the way soon, so let's look at some of the most significant challenges that this new DFE agency is likely to face, both within and outside government. Within government, Skills England has said it will be expected to work with, among others, the Industrial Strategy Advisory Council to help develop the skilled workforce that our economy needs, the Department for Business and Trade to support businesses and investors in the skills system, the Department for Work and Pensions and the Treasury to support the government's plan to get Britain working, the Migration Advisory Committee to help reduce the reliance on overseas workers, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero to support the Clean Energy Mission, and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology to support priority science and technology sectors. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, and it's already quite a list, and I'm personally not convinced that handing such an enormous list of responsibilities to a new government agency is a great idea, and these responsibilities also seem to go way beyond what the IFATE was expected to do. Rob, what's your take on this? Am I being too pessimistic, or do you have concerns about the size of the remit inside government that Skills England is being given?
No, thanks, Tom. I think there's a bit where you're right, if I'm honest, and a little bit where I might put a slightly different spin on it. But I think prefacing all that is the one thing that we've got to make sure is that Skills England works, because it's the only show in town. It's got to be effective. I think that is a massive list, and that requires a huge amount of energy and effort to get across that list. And you shouldn't underestimate some of the strength of feeling in some of those bodies that you list in terms of the mission that they're pursuing and how they're going to go forwards. And I think that it would help Skills England if within those bodies they were mandated a requirement to work with Skills England. So actually it needs to be a push as well as a pull. And at the moment, I'm not quite sure that is there. However, I would mention two things which give me the encouragement to which I referred. The first thing is the chair, Phil Smith of Skills England, is actually a member of the Industrial Strategy Advisory Committee. So that's a good start. But of course, is that coordination going to be led by the chair and the deputy chair, who's an ex-permanent secretary, or are they going to expect the chief executive of Skills England to lead that effort? And there's quite a difference between those two. So how engaged the chair and vice chair will be, I think, is an interesting aspect of this, and maybe help its success if they can get involved. The other thing is we shouldn't underestimate how disconnected government is now. And when I was working at IFATE, there were 4 or 5 very worthy government priority lists for investment. Department for Education had a view. There was a view from the Home Office, which is how they identified people that they wished to grant a form of status for living in the UK. The DWP had a list. None of those were being brought together anywhere. And I think Kirsty was pointing to this at the very beginning as one of the things that just for the Labour government coming in looked to be a discontinuity. And they felt that Skills England could do better to bring together a single vision of demand.
Kirsty, what do you make of this cross-government remit? Are all these departments and agencies necessarily going to be that interested in what a DFE agency has to say? I mean, is there a risk that Skills England actually becomes less effective if you spread it too thinly across government?
Well, I think it comes back to the core of what Rob was just saying, actually, which is if it's mandated and if it genuinely is the case that, and, we have to believe what we're being told, that this is, the Prime Minister himself is overseeing the 5 missions. You've mentioned those indirectly and directly. Each of those departments are linked to those missions. So, if we've been criticising previous governments for an age for not joining up the agenda, and now we've got a government that is at least trying to join up the agenda, whether it's too big an elephant to bite off in one go, yes, I think that is a very genuine concern. And I think the reason probably for our concerns, and I'm not putting words in Rob's mouth, but I think what Rob was probably alluding to, and I would certainly say myself, is that if Skills England doesn't have the right governance behind it and the right teeth and the right mandate to have those different departments and indeed agencies that you just listed earlier, Tom, then I think you'd be right to have that concern. And I think one of the reasons that, we're probably all waiting with bated breath is the more we get to know about Skills England, the more it seems to be getting sucked into being a department of the Department for Education. And whilst there's no doubt there's a very important role for those officials to play, to Rob's point, we need it really leading and being worked, at the chair, at the board level, at the employer level, at the level of people who understand what needs and implementing out there on the ground. So for me, this comes down to how will the governance work? How will it be mandated? And what teeth will it have to be able to sink in to those different departments so that it can say, look, you are going to be looking at skills in DWP. Right, okay, what proportion of that skills strategy is going to be kind of informed and led by the planning and coordination within Skills England so that we can properly join up what needs to happen within our social and welfare spending along with our skills needed spending, because it's obvious to everybody on the street, anybody listening to this conversation in a pub would probably be saying, if we know there are skills needed on the street and people need good jobs to live and to be able to live well, then actually, how does that not help us with our welfare spending, for example? So there are causes and consequences of not getting this right, in my view. And therefore, that's why I think, to Rob's earlier point, we sort of have to accept Skills England is now here and we've got to get behind it and make it work. But that does mean that I think we have to hope that the board and the DFE will at least listen to the experts, to people on the ground, to people who've been around, who've seen many manifestations of bodies like this. I mean, we only have to look back a few years ago and think about UKCS. Remember what the UKCS was all about, which is about basically a UK-controlled body to help look at the movement of skills and labour market and do the planning through sector councils. We kind of saw that ebb away. Then IFATE came along, and now we've got Skills England, which for me is somewhere sitting between what IFATE was doing and what UKCS did, and doing a little bit of something new as well. So there is this kind of, look, we've got to get it right this time because we only have one shot at this. And then my last point would be, you mentioned all that list of organisations that have to be involved and government departments. Rob touched on it before. We mustn't forget about the nations aspect to this. Skills don't stand still in England or in Scotland or in Wales or in Northern Ireland for that matter. They're portable, they're stackable. People need to have skills, not just national skills, but global skills that will help them, but with both national migration as well as even migration outside of the UK. So somehow we've got to get a better vision, and I hope Skills England can help with that and understand what the vision for portable, stackable skills looks like for the longer term.
Tom, I think Kirsty's made a really good point there around the influence. And actually, I think a key measure of the success of Skills England will be whether Skills England is fighting for influence or being influential. And those are very different things. And actually, if it's going to be successful, it needs to get over the former and get into the latter as quickly as possible. I think the other challenge in this space, and this was a feature at IFATE, was trying to balance the various, the competing priorities. And when you think about speaking to that array of organisations that you've talked about, they're also trying to run an approvals process underneath that. So actually that is quite a split personality, and how they manage to do that and how they manage to distribute the leadership effort and align, the people that they've got to do those things is going to be there's nothing wrong with the leadership, but it's going to be a really interesting challenge. And, one of the things that was a feature at IFATE again was we spent a lot of time fighting for influence rather than doing what we should have done. And certainly the feature of the first 2 or 3 years felt actually just trying to get the organisation established. And that wasn't only criticism from or challenges inside government, it was also outside, so if you felt the way that people looked at it, and I'll take you back to my earlier comment that's why it's so important that we do set out to help Skills England to thrive rather than leave it in that first 2 or 3 years just struggling to get established and get going and to get some credibility.
I think the other important point, I think certainly I can't speak for Rob, but at the very beginning when Skills England was sort of a twinkle in the policy noise, I think we all hoped it would be truly arm's length. Clearly it's not arm's length. And therefore, although I think the governance piece is trying to be addressed through how the board is established, and as Rob says, they're very well qualified leaders that are going to be on that board, not least the chair himself, I do think that lack of arm's lengthness is probably going to be one of its biggest challenges for the very point that Rob has just mentioned.
Well, if we're looking at competing priorities and leadership and giving it more teeth, one area where we may start to see some of this happening is around the 10 sectors that Skills England has identified as its priorities. For our listeners, those sectors are advanced manufacturing, clean energy industries, creative industries, defence, digital and technologies, financial services, life sciences and professional and business services, as well as construction and health and social care. Now, we don't yet know exactly what this prioritisation means in practice, although, as we were discussing earlier, it has been suggested that some of the funding from the upcoming Growth and Skills Levy, which is replacing the Apprenticeship Levy, may be funnelled towards these sectors rather than other parts of the economy, such as education, agriculture, tourism or transport. Kirsty, as you said at the beginning, we've had many governments in the past trying to influence the skills system and in this case trying to pick winners and maybe even offer extra cash to certain sectors in the economy. So what do you make of this idea that a new internal DFE agency like Skills England is going to pursue the same kind of agenda all over again?
Well, I suppose I've got to stay with the glasses half full for a second, Tom, because we've got to believe that if this is about focusing where the money is most needed, at skills that are most needed to drive the economy and give people an opportunity to get good work for the short, mid and longer term, then we've got to help Skills England do its job and do its job well by connecting with the local mayoral combined authorities to provide that sort of both regional, local picture and then take that back up to the national picture. So I think, we've got to stay in that territory, because if we don't, and I think it just becomes another scramble. and that's the last thing we need right now. We know that we've got to compete. And I think broadly speaking, give or take, there's always some winners and losers. I certainly wouldn't disagree with those priority areas. You would argue there's still a lot of them. So even within the long list, it's a long list. And therefore, with the limited resources the government has, and that we already know that employers, it's already been recognised in the strategy document that Skills England first produced, that employer investment in training has been on a steady decline in this last decade. And when we look at what we invest as a country through employer investment in training versus what our counterparts in the EU do, it is pretty woeful. So there is something that's got to kind of create a bit of momentum around employers recognising in these priority sectors where they need to invest, and then government being able to create the flexibility and the agility, which is kind of what we hope the Growth and Skills Levy is going to do, so that actually we do get a better working partnership between employers accepting that they do have to invest in training. This cannot just be a government job. It cannot. But actually it's being made easier for employers to do it, because the policy and the funding that does come through government is easily got at. You can get at it without some of the complexities that we have seen through the current levy. So look, broadly speaking, I think the fact that Skills England have at least issued and have got clear rationale as to why they believe they are the right sectors, I think we've got to see that as a positive. The question now is, can the funding and policy behind that become flexible enough, quickly enough, to start to attract young people into those sectors and industries? Let's not forget we've got probably the worst NEET figures, not in education, employment, training, in young people than we've had for a long time. So we've got to be able to address that issue and encourage more young people into these industries. At the same time, provide more retraining and upskilling for adults who find themselves in a scenario where the industry they may have chosen to be in is no longer going to give them the lifetime career they wanted. So therefore, can they reskill and retrain quickly for another one? And that's why I actually am a fan of initiatives like the skills boot camps, which were under the previous government, I accept. So no doubt they'll get rebranded under this government. But I don't really care what you call them, as long as you don't lose the opportunity to create those access to those shorter, more flexible skills development. And as long as we keep the focus on there being good employment at the end of it, if this Labour government can do more of that in those sectors well, then hey, great, bring it on. And if Skills England are going to be the agency to help that happen in an agile way quickly enough at a grassroots level, then look, happy days, we'll be in a good place. The question is, can we and will they?
Yeah, I think Kirsty makes a really good point about flexibility and agility, and also a really good point around bureaucracy. And those are really important, but I only think they'll go so far. I mean, the reality is at the moment that actually the allocation that DFE receives from the apprenticeship levy is all but spent. So there's not spare money sitting in that levy. So you've got to do one of two things. Is you either need to get more money, so more of the levy needs to flow into DFE to be spent, or actually you've got to defund some sectors and to move the funding elsewhere. And that has not proved to be politically possible under previous governments that I'm aware. We're all good at inventing new ways to spend money, but we're not particularly good at deciding that sector X is a priority over sector Y. So, I think a really important bellwether here is going to be to see whether there is the political appetite for that. And that's quite a high threshold, I would suggest, or whether actually we're going to see more money flow into this space. And it was really interesting to see the support for the construction sector. Of course, one of the 10 that you mentioned, and to see whether that's the sort of model that's going to happen in the future. And that's the way that privilege is going to arrive. Or is the privilege going to come from within the current funding set? The slight slowdown I think we've seen with looking at level 7 apprenticeships, indicates that this is really difficult when you're trying to generate some money from that pot.
I think that's right, Rob and Tom, if I may. I think, look, there's a basic principle here is that we've clearly got a government and even a department through DFE who are recognising all these needs. And then we've got a Treasury who aren't necessarily releasing the cash. Now, I appreciate they haven't got it. If they haven't got it, they can't release it, like all of us. If we haven't got it, we can't spend it. But, Rob has mentioned the levy and it's already being spent. That's been a raging conversation for the last few years. Where has the levy that didn't get spent gone? And, if that levy that didn't get spent has gone and has gone on other things and is not going on skills, then I think our Prime Minister, who is clearly committed to skills as part of, as I say, the 5 missions, should be asking the Chancellor and Treasury to look really hard at that, because we cannot possibly have a skills system that needs to do what it needs to do to get the country back to at least a level we can accept, let alone higher productivity, which you should be able to achieve if we don't invest in skills. And there clearly has been money there to invest in skills. And there's clearly been political decisions taken at the Treasury level, not necessarily at the Department for Education level. And therefore, both of those departments need to come together and have a very honest conversation with each other, because until we do that and until we open that back up and really understand what money are we talking about here, we're never going to make the inroads we need to make.
I suppose for listeners, Tom, the key thing to distinguish is the levy allocation to DFE is less than the levy take that the Treasury gets from taxing people's payroll. So that is the delta, and it's where that delta is used, which is a possible source of additional funding, perhaps.
Yes, we may find out more in the spending review in just a few weeks from now. Rob, you mentioned that point around bureaucracy and slowing things down. I think one of the other striking things about the ambitions around Skills England is how it's going to manage the relationships with devolved administrations within England, which we've touched on a couple of times already. So Skills England is being set up, obviously, as an internal agency within central government. But at the same time, we have a Prime Minister and a government absolutely committed to devolving more and more powers to local areas and mayoral authorities. And the government's already indicated that more funding and control over adult skills and employment services is absolutely going to be pushed down to a more local level. So we have this new central government agency being expected to have an influence in a more devolved landscape. So, Rob, how does a central government agency make itself useful when at the same time as it's talking about maybe having some control and influence over the skills system within Skills England, we've also got the Prime Minister saying we want local decisions to be driving our skills and employment services?
No, it's a really good point, Tom. And I suppose it depends a little bit about how the funding works, because you could argue the allocations are redistributed at a macro level. So an element of funding perhaps goes to Manchester or to the West Midlands Authority, and therefore the Skills England bucket is minus that. Or you could imagine some form of scenario where Skills England tries to get involved in that allocation. And I think the latter of those would be intensely difficult. So I think you're likely to be in the former box. The challenge then becomes, how does Skills England make sure that there are products available that both suit the local needs in a devolved area as well as the national need elsewhere? And how is all that joined up? And certainly we were talking about whether there should be an apprenticeship standard, an element of latitude for local circumstances. And that was being talked about, where I was involved in IFATE over a year ago, a couple of years ago, about whether that would help some of the flexibility. I think the other point I'd make here, just to sort of contextualise it a little bit, is there has been some really great work done in the devolved areas. And, it's been great to see what's emerged in the sort of Liverpool area, the Manchester area, the West Midlands Authority. That there has been some really good innovative thinking. And I'm most familiar with that in Manchester. And in this space, we look at 15 areas of the economy. They've narrowed it to 7 or 8. They've then tried to privilege those 7 or 8 by linking them with an MBAC, a Manchester baccalaureate, to help young people perhaps find their way into industries that Manchester thinks it can be world leaders in. So there are quite a lot of things that you can do, and doesn't all need money. A bit of it is about joining it up and getting a bit of team effort. I'm not saying money isn't really, really important. Funding isn't hugely important, but I think we've got to view it through a number of dimensions, and it's not just about funding. It's also about what you do to collaborate in these areas, identify your priorities, and then really go for it.
I think, actually, Rob, you make a brilliant point there, and Tom, it's probably worth pulling out. In many respects, you might argue some of the work that's being done in some of those devolved areas, like Rob's mentioned, Manchester, Liverpool, West Midlands, etc., they're almost acting already as mini Skills England satellites. So in many respects, Skills England as the national body, and I'm sure they already are, would be well advised to actually go and see, to Rob's point, what's exactly working. And in fact, actually, in a piece of work we launched with the Lifelong Learning Education Institute in the latter part of last year, there was a report called The Path to Solving the Productivity Crisis. And in that, we laid out quite a lot of recommendations for Skills England, for the government, for providers, etc. And one of the things we talked about there was Skills England helping develop these sort of regional skills observatories, really, these opportunities to create these centres of excellence where different best practice can be shared, where we can see things working in partnership with MCAs and other local partners, and then how that can be then replicated in other regions. And so I think Skills England's got a fantastic opportunity to help do that. What we will need to make sure it doesn't do is detract, to Rob's point, I think, from some of that great work that's already happening, where, local regional work is happening to connect up the dots. And in many respects, you might argue they're already doing the work of Skills England at a regional level.
Indeed, yes, we'll have to see how that dynamic plays out in future. Okay, we are almost at the end of this episode, so it's time for my final question. I recently published a report titled When Skills England Calls, Will Anybody Answer the Phone?, in which I explored some of the opportunities and risks that I've encountered through my research in terms of where Skills England could have a positive impact on our skills and training system, and also where it could, perhaps inadvertently, have a detrimental effect. There are still plenty of question marks over what Skills England will do and exactly how they will do it. So my question is, given what we know about this new DFE agency so far, what do you think Skills England could do to make it more likely that people will answer their phone calls? Kirsty, what could make important stakeholders inside and outside government want to answer a call from Skills England?
That's a great way to look at it, actually, Tom. Well, look, I think in some respects, hopefully Rob and I have covered some of that ground in this conversation we've been having with you, because I think, and I just touched on one there, the more that Skills England actually work with that local agency, those, MCAs, the more it can be seen as a partnership. And the more I think, therefore, when they do call and ask for something to happen, it's more likely it will. So that would be working in, genuinely working in partnership, I think will help with that. We talked a little bit, didn't we, before about having the teeth and having the governance, I think, to actually take action. So I think when we see the money flowing as a result of really planful skills prioritisation, and then we see the flow of that money go right to the employers and local providers in that region happening, and Skills England say, tick, look, that's how we help that happen, I think that will obviously give it grit for others to go, they do mean business. And not only will they help the money flow in the right direction, in the right way to suit what's needed at a local level, they'll also potentially take it away when those outputs aren't happening. So there's something here about people taking Skills England's role seriously in respect to, if you're not delivering your allocation in the way that's needed to those planning assumptions and to the quality that it should be, then you may actually have that funding taken away, and that funding may see itself go somewhere else. So I think there's some of the ways that I think, therefore, Skills England would have much more teeth and bite, but hopefully not just by being a stick, having some carrot attached to that as well. And as I say, encouraging much more of some of that local and partnership best practice. And then there is something about people understanding what Skills England's meant to do. I mean, we've had a flurry of information about it. They issued their first strategy document, but it's sort of gone a bit quieter, really. Other than those of us who are in the know and happen to be in the actual deep sector work, everybody else will probably wonder, well, what's happening to it? So I think there's something about a campaign around, talking about what it's doing and what it's trying to do and its vision almost, as well as talking about those really detailed points of data and where are the particular sectors that we want to be focusing on and why. Let's actually put some vision around that. I mean, I think overall, this is a government that has an opportunity to put some genuine vision around skills and lifelong learning. And as yet, I'm not necessarily seeing that come out of any of the reviews of late, to be honest with you, including Skills England. So I think putting some vision above it would be really, really helpful as well.
Thank you, Kirsty. Rob, what do you think will make people more likely to answer a call from Skills England?
Thanks, Tom. And I think I'll begin by saying that Skills England does have some cards to play. It's got some really experienced staff that are being brought across from IFATE that have, had 7 or 8 years working in this area. And of course, the history for some people goes well beyond that. They can potentially influence where money goes. That's really important. And they can influence operational processes. So at the operational level, they've got a few cards to play. But actually, my big pitch will be how they can transcend government to be relevant to solving the growth issues of today. And, we've had several goes at doing this, haven't we? We've had the skills department was in BIS, the Department for Business, and then we moved it to DFE. Those vehicles have not enabled skills to transcend government, to really penetrate. And I think Kirsty pointed to this opportunity that we have now. And for me, it's about breaking that voodoo that actually we somehow managed to get across the whole of government in a way we've not managed to do it. And you listed those really important agencies and government bodies before. They've all got to see Skills England as a partner to achieving their end. And that is a serious, serious brief.
Indeed, it is. And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Rob and Kirsty for giving their verdict on how Skills England could and should begin its journey as a new government agency. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.